Millions of ordinary Africans continue to be deprived of basic services such as water and electricity due to corruption. This is according to Corruption Perception Index released by global anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International. As the continent observed the Anti-Corruption Day earlier this week, the watchdog says sub-Saharan Africa continues to lead the world in corruption. Now for more on this, I'm joined by Karabo Mokgonyana, a legal and development practitioner and program director of the CC Fellowship and Skill Hub, and Nyasha Mpani, who is the project leader for the Data for Governance Alliance project at the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. Very good evening to you both. If I could start off with you, Karabo. In your article, you mentioned that corruption has reached alarming proportions in South Africa. Can you provide specific examples or data that illustrate the extent of corruption in the country?
Yes, good evening, Hugo, and good evening to your viewers. So, corruption has become such an impediment in South Africa, I think just on the continent holistically. And I wouldn't even want to go into stats. I would want to go into very anecdotes of what this looks like for everyday South Africans and how it really impacts them, because I think we do get into a fluff of bringing numbers but not really showing a reality to it. In terms of just things like our state-owned entities, the SAA and the ESCOM, in terms of the corruption issues that have manifested and how that has impacted just in terms of things like load shedding and service delivery. But we've also seen, mass levels of scandals around corruption in our leaders. For example, the Ngandla situation, the Palapala situation, the VBS Mutual Bank saga as well. But also, I think COVID-19, and in terms of just the funds that were stolen, the funds that were mismanaged, was a key indication of the urgency and the need for interventions to really handle the corruption within South Africa.
Now, Nyasha, the article that you co-penned mentions various measures taken by South Africa to address corruption, such as the establishment of anti-corruption agencies and the implementation of transparency mechanisms. Do you believe these measures have been effective in combating corruption? And if so, why or why not?
Thank you so much, Hugo. Yes, while these measures were put in place by the government in trying to deal with corruption, one thing that we need to understand is that does the public trust these measures? This is where we then go down to the issue of public trust in public institutions, which has significantly dropped when we look at numbers that were provided by Afrobarometer. You find that of all the key public institutions that are supposed to deal with corruption in South Africa, you find that only the court of law scored 50%. And in terms of the rest, which is the presidents, the parliament, the police, they scored less than 30% in terms of trust. So while these measures are there, you can actually tell that there is no public trust there is no trust of public institutions by citizens. So it's very difficult for us to then say these measures can be able to deal with corruption. So a lot needs to be done in terms of dealing with trust deficit that is currently troubling the country.
Karabo, we talk about corruption and assume that everybody understands what corruption is. So obviously when you talk about different sagas that have bedeviled this country, you talk about the money that was looted in the provision of various goods and services during COVID. So all of that is pretty apparent. But there's other bits of corruption that are not at the fore. Talk us through, firstly, what corruption entails holistically, and secondly, I suppose, give us some idea on how these measures are arrived at when you define South Africa as being a corrupt state or certain African countries as being corrupt countries.
Thank you, Hugo. So I always try and avoid technical terminology, especially when I do news interviews. So corruption in a nutshell has to do essentially with the use of public resources, or just in the context of business, resources that are dedicated to for a specific purpose and using it for ulterior motives, whether it is taking it for personal usage, for benefiting your loved ones, your family, and diverting it from what it essentially is meant to do. So it does manifest in different ways and in different forms. And in the context of South Africa, a big part of that is the misuse and maladministration when it comes to public funds. And we see that manifest through things like the public procurement process, where you get a friend or you get somebody you know who has a business, and then the services that the government needs is being procured by those people. Oh, even in the context of something as simple as jobs. So we've seen how it has become essential for people to either bribe or to know somebody to get into something. So those little things are how we see corruption manifest in the context of South Africa. And you can even take it as down as, the whole culture of cold drink, as we say, where you really just bribing a police, or even just within the context of the public service. Those little things manifest as corruption. And unfortunately, South Africa has normalized it. It has become entrenched within a lot of our systems, and that is unfortunate.
Nyasha, we talk about corruption being entrenched in our daily lives. So let's talk about where it all starts, and certainly how we can deal with it. I mean, when you talk about cold drink, officer, take this, it's because the officer himself is potentially either harassing you or is prepared to take a bribe or a cold drink to let you go. So where does it all start, and how do you see us dealing with these issues?
Thank you so much. I think one thing that we need to understand in terms of corruption is that it starts at a micro level, and then you've got at a macro level where it then becomes more sophisticated. This is where we see it in business, where we have got white collar crimes and how money can be financially misappropriated by different organs of the state. But at a micro level, you find that if you look at the data by Afrobarometer, it also gives a picture on how citizens are also now paying a bribe to get public documents which are supposed to be free. These are birth certificate, IDs, and passport. So you find that if a citizen is really frustrated and wants an ID, he or she is forced to then pay a bribe because he really is in desperate need of that document. So it starts at a micro level, and then it then goes at a macro level, where we now see that we've got business that are into illicit deals where money is siphoned for different uses than what it was appropriated for. So corruption, it's happening both at a macro and at a micro level.
Karabo, I suppose I feel a little bit floundered around this thinking. And can you have a country that is not corruptible if the leaders themselves are incorruptible? So I suppose my question is, does it start with the leadership? Can you have a leader or leaders, right, that are clean as a whistle, and have the rest of the country that is corrupt? Or do they go in tandem?
Corruption is very, when we individualize it, I think there's a lot of influence in terms of are the institutions and systems in place to really, create that sort of culture within our society. So in terms of cultural influence, there's definitely a high prospect of having, if you have very ethical leaders, then you may have an ethical society because they're really leading them in a specific direction. But also then in those sort of contexts, it becomes very easy to then spot out and take out the people that are really corrupt in those sort of contexts. Whereas then if you have a very corrupt leader, then a system and a culture is being put into play, and as a leader, people are going to follow, and it then creates this culture and normalizes this behavior. But it is possible. I think the two is possible in the context of having leaders who are clean and then a society that is not. But I think in the context of having ethical leaders, it is a better position to be in because it's easier to track those who are corrupt in terms of society. But also in the context of having leaders that are highly trusted, then you have exemplary leaders that are leading the society and the country in a very good direction. That is a corrupt-free society.
Nyasha, where does South Africa rate in terms of corruption watch, or when we look at those scales? I've seen South Sudan on the scale measures 11, Somalia 13. I think South Africa's in the mid-20s. So where do we rate, if those ratings are correct, compared to what would be a utopia or a perfect country? I mean, when we compare ourselves to the least corrupt nations, how do they rate versus where we are?
Hugo, I'll just throw in numbers for you, and then you can be the judge on where South Africa stands. But I think what we need to agree is that corruption is now rampant in most African countries, and South Africa is not excluded. If you look at the numbers that were provided, South African citizens say 82% of South African citizens, they say the corruption is increased in the country. And you only have got 10% of citizens who strongly believe that the government is doing well in dealing with corruption, which means that 90% of citizens don't trust the fact that the government is doing something in dealing with corruption. And then you also have got 65% of citizens who strongly believe that the president is corrupt, and 61% they believe that the police is corrupt. 63% they say the parliament is corrupt. And you have got 72% of South Africans who then fear retaliation if they report corruption. So those numbers, they can paint a picture of where South Africa is when it comes to corruption.
Now, Karabo, based on those numbers that Nyasha has articulated, it's obviously opinion-based and not real figures. But looking at the numbers that we see in the papers, which I think are a large contributor to people's perception of where corruption levels are in South Africa, just how many cases of corruption go unreported versus what's actually in the media? So do we have a real picture of where corruption is based purely on the numbers that we see, or is it worse? Is it more catastrophic than we think it is?
I do feel like there is a data gap, and that's because this topic is quite it's a bit of a controversial one in terms of people coming out, in terms of speaking on it, because, for example, in the context of the African continent, people are attacked for actually speaking on these kinds of topics. So even just in terms of the data in itself, I think there's really great progress in terms of, institutions that are contributing to the conversation. But I do feel like there's definitely missing context and missing voices that could speak to a harsher reality of what the corruption context really do look like. And those are the voices that fear for their lives, because I think a lot of people don't really tap into this topic. But at the same time, I do feel like the data that is out there should be useful in terms of giving us context as to we need to do something. This is alarming in the context of the service delivery is actually matching in terms of a lot of funds being diverted and service delivery slacking in our country. Just in terms of also public trust as well is reducing. I think even with the national elections coming up, that is going to be a big reflection of where people are. There's little trust in terms of electoral processes. There's the whole narrative of, what's the point? Nothing is going to change. So those little things are very much adding to the data to show that it is a problem and South Africans are actually realizing how much corruption is actually affecting their daily lives.
So finally, can you talk to us about what you think civil society organizations and certainly the public can do to hold public officials to account? There seems to be very little to nothing that's being done in the South African space.
We also need to know that when we are talking about corruption, it's not only those who hold public office. There is also corruption even in the civil society space. You find that even in the data that Afrobarometer shared with us, 29% of citizens also say business executives are also corrupt. So it's not only about those who hold public office. So corruption is also rampant even within the civil society space. So a lot needs to be done in terms of how we need to fight corruption, both in the public and in the private sector.
The opinion holds true, apparently, that most South Africans think that public officials are extremely corrupt. And that was a conversation we're having this evening with Karabo Mokgonyana, a legal and development practitioner and program director, and Nyasha Mpani. Appreciate your time, and thank you so much for speaking to us